Princess Kate broke royal tradition when making an early appearance at Wimbledon yesterday. The Princess of Wales did not sit in the royal box at center court. Instead, she opted to
The gardens at Buckingham Palace were in full bloom. The afternoon light fell softly across the manicured lawns, and a small crowd of invited guests had gathered for what was supposed to be one of the most elegant royal garden ceremonies of the season. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had arrived first. She was composed, radiant, and every inch the future queen the country had come to admire. She greeted guests with practiced grace, exchanged quiet words with palace aides, and stood near the central pavilion where the ceremony was meant to begin within minutes. Everything was in place. The protocol was flawless. The weather was cooperating. And then Camilla arrived. She stepped out of her car, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the gathering, with the calm confidence of a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of being unhurried. But it was not her walk that stopped the afternoon. It was not her smile. It was what sat atop her head, catching the sunlight in a way that made several guests freeze mid-sentence. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara was not there. The Delhi Durbar tiara was not there. It was the sapphire and pearl tiara, the one that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, the one that carried a weight no gemstone could ever account for. And Catherine saw it. She did not gasp. She did not stumble. She simply stopped moving. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update on this developing story. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but inside those seconds, something shifted in a way that no protocol officer could repair. Catherine turned to a senior aide standing nearby and spoke in a voice so controlled that only those within arm's length could hear her. The ceremony, she said, would need to wait. She did not shout. She did not make a scene. She did not draw attention. She simply halted the event with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that some moments could not be allowed to proceed as if nothing had happened. The aide looked at her, then looked toward Camilla, who was still walking the path toward the pavilion, perhaps unaware of what she had triggered, or perhaps very aware. The garden ceremony, which had been planned for weeks, which had involved coordination between the Lord Chamberlain's office, the royal household, and several charitable organizations, was paused. Guests were gently directed toward the refreshment tent. The musicians who had been preparing to play lowered their instruments, and Catherine walked away from the pavilion, not toward the palace, but toward a quiet corner of the garden where she could stand alone for a moment, her back to the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her. This was not a tantrum. This was not a display of jealousy. This was something far deeper, something that reached into the very heart of what the monarchy means to the people who keep it alive. To understand why this moment carried such devastating weight, the story does not begin in that garden. It begins decades earlier, in a world of state dinners and ceremonial precedents, where jewelry is never just jewelry. In the royal household, every tiara, every brooch, every necklace carries a documented history. Ceremonial precedents meant the formal ranking of who wore what, when, and in whose presence, a system so intricate that the Lord Chamberlain's office maintained detailed records of every piece worn at every official event, stretching back generations. The sapphire and pearl tiara, often associated with Diana, was not merely an accessory, it was a symbol. Diana had worn it during some of the most photographed moments of her royal life. It had appeared in portraits, in press coverage, in the collective memory of a nation that had watched her transform from a shy young bride into the most famous woman in the world. When Diana died, the pieces associated with her did not simply return to the royal vault and disappear. They became something else. They became relics. They became emotional landmarks in the story of a family that had lost its most beloved member and never fully recovered. The tiara had been part of the Spencer family collection, but its association with Diana had made it something larger than its provenance. It was the piece that, more than almost any other, the public connected with Diana's image, her grace, her isolation, her defiance, and her heartbreak. For Catherine, who had stepped into a role that the public instinctively measured against Diana's legacy, the tiara was not something she had ever claimed for herself. She had worn other pieces. She had honored Diana in quieter ways, through her work, her demeanor, her devotion to her children, and the subtle echoes of Diana's compassion that she had woven into her own public identity. She had never needed that tiara. She had never asked for it. But she had also never expected to see it on Camilla's head. That was the line. Not a line drawn in protocol, not a line written in any palace document, a line drawn in memory, in loyalty, and in the unspoken understanding that some things simply did not cross. The trigger incident, the moment that cracked open the afternoon, was not planned in the way palace ceremonies usually are. According to those familiar with the internal arrangements, the selection of jewelry for the garden ceremony had been handled through the standard channels. The Queen Consort's household had submitted a request for pieces from the royal vault through the keeper of the jewel house, the official responsible for maintaining and allocating the crown's collection of ceremonial pieces. The request had listed several options. The sapphire and pearl tiara was among them. Whether it was selected deliberately or chosen from a list without full awareness of its emotional significance remains a question that the palace has not addressed. But the result was the same. Camilla arrived wearing it, and the moment she did, the ceremony ceased to be about gardens and guests and charitable partnerships. It became about something the monarchy had spent decades trying to manage: the living presence of Diana's memory inside the institution that had once tried to contain her. What happened next moved from the garden into the private corridors of the palace with a speed that surprised even seasoned courtiers. Catherine did not confront Camilla in front of the guests. She did not create a public moment that photographers could capture and newspapers
the truth
could
became
splash
impossible
across
to
their front
contain.
pages. She did
Catherine had
something more
forced the
powerful and
anniversary
more
to
painful.
answer for Diana.
She went to William.
Camilla left
William,
the room
who was
first,
inside the palace
and her
preparing
silence
to join
told the household
ceremony
more
later
than
in the
any
program,
statement could.
was informed by
The
an
Queen
aide that the
Consort
garden
sat
event had
alone
been
for several
paused.
minutes,
He was told
hands
that Catherine had
clasped
requested
tightly,
a moment.
face
He was
controlled,
told in careful
pride
language
wounded.
that there was a concern
She had believed the
regarding
tiara
Queen
was proof of
Consort's choice of
acceptance,
headpiece.
a sign
He
that her
understood
place
immediately.
beside Charles
He did not
had
need a
finally
detailed
become secure.
explanation. He did not
Instead,
need to see a
it had become
photograph.
the object
The
that
words were
exposed
enough,
every old
because
fracture.
William had
The
lived his
coronation
entire life
anniversary
inside the
program,
echo of his
the
mother's
planned
memory.
order of
And he
speeches,
knew,
appearances,
better than anyone
and royal
alive,
movements for
which
the day
pieces of her legacy
had now been
carried
formally
weight that could
delayed
not be
under the
measured in
phrase
carats or
private
historical
royal
provenance.
consultation.
The conversation
Those
that
words
followed
sounded
between William
calm.
and Catherine was
Everyone
not loud.
knew they meant
It was
crisis.
not dramatic in the way that
Catherine
palace
withdrew
rumors
with
often suggest. No one raised their voice, but the silence between their words carried more force than any argument could have. Catherine told him simply that she could not proceed with the ceremony as though the sight had not shaken her. She told him that it was not about possession. It was not about who had the right to wear what. It was about what it meant to the country, to the people who still lit candles for Diana, to the mothers who told their daughters stories about the princess who had walked through minefields and held the hands of AIDS patients
Sophie,
when the world
and the
was still
trusted
afraid
confidant
to touch.
did not offer
The tiara
empty
was not a
comfort.
crown.
She
It was a
told the
memory.
princess that
And seeing it
silence
on
would have been
Camilla's head
easier,
felt to
but it
Catherine
would not have been
like
honest.
watching that memory
Catherine
being
absorbed that
into an
quietly
institution
because
that had
she knew
once turned its
exactly
back
why
on
the moment
woman who had
mattered.
made it meaningful.
Diana's memory
William
was not
listened.
only family
He did
pain,
not dismiss her
it was
concern.
public trust.
He did not tell her
If
she
the
was
palace could
overreacting.
place that
He did
symbol
not
on
say it was
Camilla
just a
without
piece of
warning
jewelry,
William or
because he
Catherine,
knew it was not.
then every
He had
promise
always
about
known.
respect,
But William
healing,
also
and
understood
unity
the
meant very
institutional
little.
dimension in a way
Sophie
that
saw the
added
strain
another
in her
layer of
face
complexity
and stayed
to an
close,
already painful
not as a
moment.
shield,
Camilla was
but as
Queen
proof
Consort.
that Catherine had
The
not
official
stood
household
alone.
was the
William
administrative
received
body that managed the daily operations and ceremonial arrangements of the reigning monarch and his consort, and within that structure, Camilla had certain rights of access to the royal collection. She was not wearing a stolen piece. She was not violating a written rule. The tiara, depending on its exact classification, may have been available through the standard allocation process. But availability and propriety are not the same thing. And William knew that the palace's failure to recognize the difference was not just an oversight. It was a failure of emotional intelligence at the highest level of the institution. He had expected concern from the household. He had not expected this kind of blindness. The monarchy could survive many things: scandal, political tension, economic uncertainty, even the departure of a senior family member. But it could not survive the appearance of dishonoring Diana's memory without consequence. Not while William was alive, not while Catherine stood beside him, not while the country still carried the scar. The private confrontation that followed was not between Catherine and Camilla. It was between William and his father. Charles, who had been briefed on the pause ceremony, summoned William to his private study. The room was familiar to both of them, paneled in dark wood, lined with books, quiet in the way that only rooms inside working palaces can be. Charles asked William to explain what had happened. William told him. He told him that Catherine had halted the ceremony because Camilla had arrived wearing Diana's sapphire tiara. He told him that the household had approved the selection without flagging its significance. He told him that the country would see it as a provocation, whether it was intended as one or not. Charles listened with the stillness of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the space between personal feeling and institutional duty. He did not dismiss William's concern, but he also did not immediately agree that the situation was as dire as William believed. He pointed out that Camilla was queen consort, that she had a right to access the collection, that the allocation had followed proper channels. William's response was quiet and devastating. He told his father that proper channels were precisely the problem. Because proper channels had no memory. Proper channels did not remember the photographs. Proper channels did not remember the funeral. Proper channels did not remember two boys walking behind their mother's coffin while the world watched and wept. Proper channels saw provenance and protocol. They did not see pain. The silence that followed that exchange was the kind that changes things. Not immediately. Not with a signed document or a public announcement, but in the way that future decisions would be made, in the way that the household would handle Diana-associated pieces from that point forward, in the way that Charles would come to understand that his son's loyalty to his mother's memory was not a sentiment to be managed, but a boundary to be respected. This was not a rebellion. This was not a challenge to the crown. This was a son telling his father, in the quietest and most absolute terms, that some lines could not be crossed. Not by protocol, not by precedent, not by anyone. The truth was more painful
caution.
than any headline
The private
could
secretary,
capture.
a
Because
senior
the headline
aide who
would say
handles
that Catherine
sensitive
had
royal
halted the
papers and
ceremony.
instructions,
The headline
did
would
not
say that
need
there
to
was
explain
tension
much.
between the Princess
The
of
note
Wales
said
and the
enough.
Queen Consort.
Catherine's
The
earlier
headline would say
objection
that
was
the
marked in
palace
the
was in
margin.
crisis.
Her
But
concern
inside
had
the
not
family,
disappeared.
the truth was
It had been
simpler and
recorded.
sadder.
The
A
final
woman who
selection
carried
had still
herself with
moved forward.
extraordinary dignity had
Charles
been asked
stared
by
at the
very
page,
institution
and the
she
king's
served
silence
to watch her
became
husband's
heavier than
mother's
any
most
argument.
iconic symbol
William
be
saw
placed
his
on the
father's
head of the woman
expression
who had
change.
replaced her.
The prince
And she
knew
had
then.
decided in a single moment of clarity that she would not pretend it was acceptable. The institutional escalation that followed moved with the careful precision that the palace reserves for moments of genuine sensitivity. The Lord Chamberlain's office was informed. The keeper of the jewel house was asked to review the allocation process for pieces with significant public and emotional associations. A protocol review was initiated, not publicly, not with fanfare, but through the quiet internal channels that govern how the royal household corrects itself when something has gone wrong. The review was not about punishing anyone. It was about ensuring that the institution developed what it had clearly lacked in this instance: a mechanism for recognizing when a piece of jewelry was not just a piece of jewelry. The royal collection contained thousands of items, each with its own history, but only a handful carried the kind of emotional weight that could halt a ceremony and shake a family. Those pieces needed to be identified. Their use needed to be governed not just by provenance and protocol, but by understanding. That was the lesson. And it was a lesson that arrived not through a policy memo, but through a moment of genuine pain. The public leak, as it always does in stories like this, came not through an official statement, but through the slow, inevitable process of palace whispers reaching outside ears. A guest at the garden ceremony had noticed the pause. A member of the household had spoken to someone who spoke to someone else. A reporter who covered the royal beat received a tip that something unusual had occurred. The first headlines were cautious. They mentioned a delay. They mentioned an unspecified issue. But within hours, the details began to emerge. The tiara, Diana's tiara, Camilla wearing it, Catherine halting the ceremony. And the country reacted with a force that surprised even those who understood the depth of Diana's legacy. Social media filled with photographs of Diana wearing the sapphire tiara.
It had been wounded.
With images
Charles
of Camilla
could delay
arriving
the
at
program,
The
and aides
contrast
could
was
soften
visceral.
the language.
The comments were
but
not
no one
measured.
could
They
undo
were
the sight
raw,
of Catherine
emotional,
refusing
and
to move.
overwhelmingly supportive
William
of
found Catherine
People
before the
who had
palace
never met
found
her
its official
wrote
story.
that she had done what the
Prince did
institution
not
had
speak
failed
at
to do
first.
for decades.
He simply
She had
stood
protected
beside her,
Diana's memory.
carrying the
She
same
had drawn a
memory,
line that
the
everyone
same
could see,
anger,
and
and
that
the
no
same
one could
decision
dismiss as
forming
protocol.
between them.
Broadcasters
Catherine
picked
looked
up
at
the
him,
story.
and understood that the next choice would not belong to aides, files, or palace
had failed to flag it, whether the moment reflected a deeper tension between the queen consort's household and the future king and queen. The palace issued no immediate comment, which was itself a communication. In the royal world, silence after an incident meant that discussions were ongoing, that the situation was being taken seriously, and that no easy resolution had been reached. Yet the story did not end with headlines or public debate. It ended, as the most important royal stories always do, in a private moment that no camera captured. Late that evening, after the garden had been cleared and the guests had departed, and the household staff had returned to their routines, Catherine and William stood together on a balcony overlooking the palace grounds. The gardens were dark now, the lights casting long shadows across the lawns where the ceremony had been paused just hours earlier. William stood close to her. He did not say much. He did not need to. Catherine looked out over the grounds and said, very quietly, that she had not wanted to cause a problem. She had not wanted to create a headline. She had not wanted to make the afternoon about herself. But she could not, she said, stand in that garden and smile while the world took photographs of Diana's tiara on someone else's head. She could not let that image become part of the royal record without someone, somewhere, saying that it was wrong. William took her hand. He told her that she had not caused a problem. She had done something that he had not been strong enough to do himself, or perhaps had been too close to the pain to see clearly. She had stood for his mother when the institution had forgotten to, and he would make sure that it was remembered, not as a confrontation, not as a crisis, but as a moment when the future of the monarchy showed that it understood what the past had cost. The days that followed were careful and deliberate. The palace did not issue a dramatic statement. There was no press conference, no official apology, no public naming of who had approved the tiara selection. Instead, the household implemented a quiet but significant change. A review was conducted of all pieces in the royal collection, with strong public associations, particularly those connected to Diana. A new layer of consultation was added to the allocation process for ceremonial jewelry, one that required not just historical and logistical approval, but emotional and contextual consideration. The change was not announced. It was not designed to generate favorable coverage. It was designed to ensure that what happened in that garden never happened again. And in the quiet way that the monarchy operates when it is at its best, the institution absorbed the lesson without spectacle. The official household adjusted its procedures. The keeper of the jewel house updated the records. And a note was added to the file of the sapphire and pearl tiara, a note that simply stated that the piece carried exceptional public and emotional significance, and that its use required consultation with the offices of both the Queen Consort and the Prince of Wales. Camilla's response to the incident was handled with the restraint that had come to define her public role. She did not comment publicly. She did not defend her choice. Those close to her suggested that she had not fully appreciated the weight the tiara carried, that the selection had been made from a list of available pieces without a deliberate intention to invoke Diana's memory. Whether that was true, or whether it was the version that the palace preferred to circulate, the country would never know for certain. But the absence of a public confrontation between Catherine and Camilla was itself a sign that the institution had learned something. In an earlier era, this kind of moment might have escalated into a public feud, into competing statements, into a season of headlines that would have damaged everyone involved. Instead, the palace absorbed the shock internally. The household corrected its process. The family, wounded but intact, moved forward. The country saw one thing in the headlines: a dramatic pause.
The message, while aides were still trying to steady the room. The prince looked down, read it once, then read it again. The message confirmed that the tiara choice had been discussed after Catherine's objection, which meant the warning had traveled higher than anyone first admitted. William's expression changed from anger to cold certainty. He had wanted to believe this was careless. Now he understood it had been allowed. Catherine saw his face and knew the truth had reached him too. Charles moved quickly after that. The king ordered the wardrobe file sealed for internal review, meaning the papers linked to Camilla's final styling decision would be locked down and examined by senior staff. That order frightened the aides because it meant the monarch wanted names, not excuses. Camilla heard about the sealed file and stiffened. The Queen Consort understood
with the staff who cared for them. She listened. She held hands. She laughed softly when a child made a joke. And when she left, the photographs that circulated were not of a princess in crisis, but of a woman who understood, in her bones, what it meant to carry forward a legacy of compassion that transcended jewelry and protocol and palace walls. That was the real story. Not the tiara, not the pause, not the confrontation. The real story was about a family learning, slowly and painfully, that some memories are not assets to be allocated, but sacred trusts to be guarded. The monarchy had survived the afternoon, but more importantly, it had been reminded of what it was supposed to survive for. Not for tradition alone, not for ceremony alone, not for the jewels in the vault or the titles in the letters patent, but for the people, living and remembered, who gave those things their meaning. Catherine had drawn a line, and in doing so, she had not weakened the monarchy. She had strengthened it in the only way that ever lasts, by showing that it could still feel, could still remember, and could still choose love over protocol, when the two could no longer be reconciled. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.